Hi everybody, this is Ibarionex from the Candid Frame. One of the things, one of the challenges that we face as street photographers is trying to make something extraordinary out of the ordinary. There are some magical, exciting moments that happen to us in front of the street that we manage to capture in a photograph. But more often than not, it's just ordinary stuff that presents itself. And the challenge is, can we find a way of taking something common, ordinary, mundane, and within the context of the frame, make it into something interesting? And I was thinking, well, how about just sitting down? Can we make interesting photographs of people that are just sitting down? So that's the idea for this video. But before we do that, I want to remind you that I did just finish my latest book. It's going to be my sixth. It's called Making Photographs, Developing a Personal Visual Workflow. And it goes over all the principles that I teach in my photographic workshops and that I present to you in these videos each week. So if you're interested in finding out more about my personal approach to street photography, you can pre-order the book, which is due out, I think, in November or December, and possibly a little earlier. But if you want to place a pre-order, you can do so using the Amazon affiliate link below. But let's take a look at some photographs. Here we have a shot by Des. This was created with a Fujifilm X Pro 2 at 180th of a second, f2.5, ISO 3200. So here's this fellow that's taking a cigarette break at what I assume is a restaurant. And he's just sitting there on this red chair taking a drag of this cigarette, and while there's some people in the background in the kitchen. I think she's on her phone, and then we see evidence of the other things that are part of this restaurant, what appears to be a menu on the left. There's some metal and some styrofoam and some cardboard containers on the right. And this image is really simple enough. There's just this guy taking a break from his day at work, taking a drag of the cigarette. And for me, what makes this shot interesting is just how relaxed he is in this scene. He doesn't seem to be aware at all of the photographer and the camera. So his body language is completely natural, very relaxed. His right hand is on his knee while his other hand is coming up to his face and taking a drag of the cigarette. And he seems to be completely lost in thought as he looks out into the distance. I imagine him not really looking at anything specifically, rather that he is just lost in his own thoughts. So the gesture here is something that I really like. The body language here is really important. But the other things that happen here are line and shape. There's a repetition of shape and pattern that exists throughout the frame here. You see it in these sort of almost rectangular, rounded corner shapes here. But we have rectangles and all throughout the composition. You see it here in these things beyond the door. You see it in the shape of the styrofoam, in the boxes, in all the different elements in the background. So that repetition of shape provides a visual anchor for the image. And then you have splendid color. I mean, we're dealing, I think, with primarily artificial light. It looks like this maybe was shot in the evening, because it looks like the light that is illuminating this area here is illuminating his face. But that quality of light, even though it's artificial, falls on him really, really nicely. And the rendering of color here is great. I really like that blue towel hanging over his shoulder. I think it provides a really nice counterpoint to the more warm colors, particularly of the seats that he's sitting on, the red elements here. There's a little fire hydrant here. There's some red, but there's a repetition of that color that happens inside here in the interior, and even there's sort of a bluish color cast against the styrofoam and the wall itself. So what makes the shot work for me isn't just the fact that this guy is just sitting there. He's actively doing something, even though it's as simple as him just taking a drag from a cigarette. But it's not just the gesture there. What makes the image work is the fact that Des is paying attention to all these other things that compositionally strengthen the shot. He's got good light. He's got great line and shape. He's got color. He's got gesture. He has all those things that I talk about every week that really increases your chances of making a really good photograph. Now, you can have all of those things, and that doesn't automatically mean that you have a fantastic photograph, but you do increase your chances of pulling off a really good shot if you have those other elements. That's why it's so important that when you see a scene like this, to not be solely focused on the fact that this guy is an interesting character. You have to pay attention to everything else that's happening in the frame and make a conscious choice of not only what to include in the frame, but how you want to place those various elements within the frame to produce as strong a composition as possible. Our next shot is by d.xin, and this was created with a Fujifilm X Pro 2 at 1/100th of a second, f4, ISO 6400. So here we have this guy sitting in a subway car, and he is completely lost in his music or his podcast or whatever he's listening to. Considering the sort of blissful look that he has on his face, I can only assume that he's listening to music, because I love the way that gesture of him bringing his hand up to his chest and that expression on his face, that he's completely enraptured with whatever she's listening to. And that everyone else, this crowd of people that surround him, are not even there for him. And it's really interesting that contrast is created, because anyone who's ever carried or who traveled on public transportation knows that people are in their own world, but they usually have this sort of blank expression on their face. If they're not distracted by their phone or their book or whatever it is that they're using to keep themselves occupied as they're traveling from point A to point B, very few people express any sort of emotion on their faces. There's sort of this cold, empty stare that most people exhibit when they're traveling. But this guy doesn't seem to care about any of that. He's riding in this car with all these people, and he's in a completely different world. And he's sitting down. What makes this shot interesting? What makes it work? Well, as I've just said, there's the gesture. And even though we're dealing with artificial light here in this subway car, which is often terrible and requires you to often use a very high ISO to make it work, the light here works for him because it's falling just on his face, and you can see that shadow underneath his chin. The light is falling on him beautifully. And I really like that shadow underneath his chin, providing us a really sense of depth. It's not completely flat. And there's also the tonality here. I think it's a good move to make this shot a black and white, because if you're dealing with a subway car, you're often dealing with artificial light, which in terms of color balance is always really difficult to correct if it's not just outright atrocious. And here, by converting it to black and white, you're dealing with tonalities. And the dark black of his jacket or his sweater helps to really define his hand against his chest and to help frame his face as he's, listening to his music. And that strong bit of contrast helps to guide our eye straight to him. Because if you look at the other elements in the background, the other people there, most of those people fall into areas of more like middle gray. They're a lot flatter. They don't possess the strong contrast that he possesses there. I don't know how much d.xin here may have enhanced the image, by doing some burning or dodging or whatever in order to enhance that. But he makes great use of those tonalities here in this frame. And the use of the shallow depth of field also helps greatly in terms of isolating this figure against all this busyness that's in the background. By blurring that background, it creates more of a visual draw to that person, to that gesture, to that expression. Everyone else in the frame provides a context of place. We may not know exactly what city we're in or what country we're in, but we all recognize this moment because we've been in this moment ourselves countless times. And it's just wonderful to capture this really quiet, personal moment on public transportation and produce such a nice, pleasing shot. Here we have a shot by Bjane Levine. This was created with a Sony Alpha 9 at 160th of a second at f8 ISO 500. All right, so here we have this kid sitting on a bench in the middle of Times Square. And we have that figure of the guy dressed up as the Statue of Liberty in the background, and the traditional marquees and signage that appear all in that area of New York. And this kid is sitting down, seems to have a tablet in his lap, and he seems to be responding to something. Maybe it's one of the billboards, maybe he's seeing something in the distance that's caught his attention. It must be something interesting, because most kids just keep their faces buried in a tablet or a phone nowadays. So it's really interesting that the kid is reacting to something outside of that electronic device here. But what makes the shot interesting for me, again, for the third time, is the gesture. It's the body language. The kid is just not sitting there. He's expressing himself in some way by, the way his legs are crossed, the body language, the upturned head, and the hand gesture. Just because someone is sitting down doesn't mean that they stop expressing themselves physically. And that's something to sort of keep an eye out for, because people are constantly shifting in a chair, trying to get comfortable, maybe reading a book or smoking a cigarette or answering a phone or playing with their hair or scratching their arm. There's always something that's happening when someone is sitting down for any period of time. And if there is something about the scene that interests you, the figure of the person may have drawn you in, and you may see that there's interesting light, line, and shape and all those things. But if you observe someone over a period of time, things are going to change. Very subtle things are going to change, and that's why it's so important to sort of linger and observe someone for a while and not simply make a single photograph. In this shot, what makes the image work is the whole color play. We got the great yellow and white striped shirt here, which creates this nice contrast that helps draw us to him in the scene. And despite the sort of busyness that we see in the background, we get these implied diagonal lines here on the street and here in the background with the billboards that help guide our eye straight to this person. We have a lot of stuff in the background, which typically would be distracting, but here provides a really strong sense of place. You look at this shot, and within seconds, you know exactly where you are. Having the role player dressed up as the Statue of Liberty, removes any doubt of where we are. You could see evidence by just the cityscape and the elements behind of where this is. So that's really important towards the shot. But let me get back to the kid, because I think it is the body language and the expression of the kid that carry this shot and make it much more interesting. And with all three shots, it's just people sitting down. But just because a person is sitting down doesn't mean that you should stop seeing carefully. Because whether it's a perfect stranger or someone that you know, if you just sit down in a Times Square, in a park, or at the beach, and you just look at people just sitting down, don't even try to make a photograph. Just look at what happens over the span of 5 minutes. See how things change as they watch people pass by or do whatever they do. They're not just rigidly in that spot. There's a fluidity, a dynamic that happens with someone when they're sitting down. And if you're patient enough, and if you're careful enough about your seeing, you will see all those changes, and you will realize that there's more to photographing this person than just the way that they look. There's a sort of dance that happens, even though they're sitting in their chair, that is just ripe for a street photographer. Hope you found that helpful. If you want to submit images to the Candid Frame Flickr Pool, because that's where I pull all these images for these videos, all you have to do is go to Flickr, do a search on the Candid Frame, and ask to be added. And you'll have to do it on your computer. If you attempt to do it on your tablet or your phone, you'll get a notification that this is a private group and you won't be able to add it. So if you go to your computer and do it, I'll be more than glad to do it. I usually get to it once a week. So if I don't get it to immediately know that I eventually will. I usually do it on the Thursday or Friday that I actually produce these videos. And if you've never heard of the Candid Frame and this is your first experience with us, the Candid Frame is a podcast which I've been producing for the last 12 and a half years, in which I feature conversations with photographers about their work and their careers. You can go to thecandidframe.com and we have the entire archive available. My most recent conversation was with a photographer named Forrest Walker. He's a travel photographer, a street photographer who is amazing. And for the last 5 years, he's been traveling around the world with the intent of going to 100 different cities and making photographs. It's an amazing journey, an amazing story. If you've never heard an episode of The Candid Frame, start with this one because it's really, really phenomenal. And you can go to thecandidframe.com and stream it there, or you can go to iTunes and subscribe. As well, we have an app that's available for free for both Android and for Apple iOS, and you'll find the link right there on the website. So thanks again for joining me, and I'll see you next time.